The first time I found out my father kept secrets, I was 46 years old, standing in an attic that smelled like cedar and old paper, holding a letter that wasn't addressed to me. That's not how you expect to learn the truth about your own family. You expect a conversation, a deathbed confession, something with warning built into it, some kind of runway. What you don't expect is a shoebox, wedged behind a water heater, with your name never once written on anything inside it. My name is Daniel Ferris. I'm 46 years old. I restore old furniture for a living, which means I spend my days putting broken things back together and quietly pretending that skill transfers to the rest of life. It doesn't. I learned that the hard way, in an attic, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 days after we buried my father. Stick with me on this one. It goes somewhere, and it takes a while to get there, the way the real ones always do. If you're the kind of person who likes stories about families and the things they hide from each other, this is for you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. You're going to want to be here for the next one too. Let me back up. All the way back, this time, because you need the whole shape of it to understand why an old shoebox nearly split a family down the middle. My father, Walter Ferris, was 79 when he died. A quiet man. He spent 31 years running a small print shop on Delancey Street before he sold it and retired into a life of woodworking and crossword puzzles, which is probably where I got the furniture thing from, if I'm honest about it. He wasn't a man who talked about feelings. He was a man who fixed the gutter when it needed fixing and never once asked to be thanked for it. If you wanted to know how my father felt about you, you didn't ask him. You watched what he did on a Tuesday when nobody was looking. My mother passed when I was 22, so for the last 24 years it had been my father, my older sister Renata, and me. Renata handled the family the way she handled everything. Efficiently, a little coldly, always 3 steps ahead of whatever room she was standing in. She'd married a man named Colin 14 years ago, an insurance adjuster with a firm handshake and an opinion about everything. And the two of them had folded themselves neatly into my father's life the way people do when they're waiting on something. Though back then I couldn't have told you what. I didn't think much of it at the time. Families lean on each other. That's supposed to be normal. It's only in hindsight that leaning starts to look like something else. The funeral was on a Saturday. Small, dignified, the way my father would have wanted it. No long speeches, just people who actually knew him standing in a cold chapel, saying quiet things to each other over paper cups of bad coffee. Renata cried exactly the right amount, at exactly the right moments. Colin stood with his hand on her shoulder the entire service, looking appropriately solemn, the specific solemn of a man who has rehearsed being solemn in a mirror. I didn't cry until I got home that night and found one of my father's old flannel shirts still hanging on the hook by the back door, like he was going to walk in any minute, and put it on to go check the mail. 3 days later, Renata called me. "We need to clean out the house," she said. No preamble. No "how are you holding up?" That was Renata. Before it goes on the market. It hasn't even been a week. The market doesn't wait for grief, Daniel. A pause. The kind she used when she wanted you to feel the weight of her patience. I already talked to a realtor. She thinks we could list by May if we move fast. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone and feeling something cold slide down the back of my neck. Not because she was wrong about the timeline, because she'd already talked to a realtor 3 days after the funeral, and she'd already made calls, already lined up a stranger to walk through our father's kitchen with a clipboard and a price per square foot. "Fine," I said. "I'll take the attic and the garage. You take the rest of the house." She agreed so quickly I should have known something was off. Renata never gave up the easy jobs without a reason. The house on Larch Street was the house I grew up in. A narrow 2-story with green trim. My father repainted himself every 8 years like clockwork, whether it needed it or not. Climbing into that attic felt like climbing into a part of my own chest I'd forgotten was there. Boxes of Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper from a decade nobody remembered. My old baseball glove, stiff with age, the leather cracked at the palm. A steamer trunk full of my mother's old dresses that none of us had ever had the heart to give away, 24 years running. And behind the water heater, wedged into a gap in the insulation like someone had put it there on purpose and then spent years convincing themselves to forget about it, a shoebox. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. Some instinct in me, some old animal sense, told me that whatever was in there had been hidden on purpose, and hidden things are hidden for a reason. And maybe the kind thing to do was to just throw the box in with the donation pile and never look. I sat there with it in my lap for a full 5 minutes before I lifted the lid. Inside, a stack of letters, tied with a rubber band gone brittle and yellow with age. A bank passbook from an institution that had merged and remerged so many times the name printed on the cover no longer existed anywhere. And a folded legal document that turned out, once I smoothed it flat on my knee, to be a deed. Not to the house on Larch Street. To a different property entirely. A small commercial building 40 minutes north, in a town called Hollis Creek, that I had never once heard my father mention in 46 years of being his son. The letters were the part that changed everything. They were addressed to my father, from a woman named Louise Abbott, spanning a period of about 6 years starting when I was 9 years old. I want to be careful here, because some of what's in those letters belongs to a person who's still living, and I'm not going to spread another woman's private history across the internet for views. But I'll tell you the shape of it, because the shape of it is what changed my life. Louise Abbott had been my father's business partner. Not romantically. I want to be clear about that up front, because it's the first thing everyone assumes, and it's not what this is. She had put up half the starting money for the print shop back in an era when a woman's name on a business deed was rare enough that the two of them had agreed, quietly, to keep her ownership off the public paperwork and split the profits privately between themselves instead. A handshake arrangement. It had worked, according to the earliest letters, for almost a decade. Then something had gone wrong. The letters got harder to read the further into the stack I went. A decision my father had apparently made without consulting her. Expanding the shop, taking on debt, restructuring the partnership in a way that, on paper, quietly erased her half of it. A decision that cost her a significant amount of money at a point in her life when she couldn't afford to lose it. The early letters were confused, hurt. The middle ones were angry, precise, itemized, the letters of someone building a case. The later ones were just tired. The last letter in the stack, dated the year I turned 15, was different from the rest. Shorter, colder. I've read it so many times now I could recite it from memory, but I'll just tell you what it said. Asterisk Walter. I've decided not to pursue this further, for reasons that have nothing to do with what's fair and everything to do with being tired. But I want you to know I haven't forgotten, and I don't forgive it. The Hollis Creek building was supposed to be the thing that made it right. If it ever actually becomes that, good. If it doesn't, then you'll have taken something from me twice. L. Asterisk. I sat on that attic floor with the letter in my hands for a long time. Long enough that the light through the little round window shifted from afternoon gold to something dimmer, grayer, the kind of light that makes a house feel like it's holding its breath. If you've been with me a while, you know I like to slow down at the parts that matter instead of rushing to the ending. This is one of those parts. So bear with me. I didn't say anything to Renata that day. I've turned that decision over in my head more times than I can count since, trying to understand my own reasons for it. Part of it was simple. I didn't understand yet what I was holding, and some old habit of my father's had rubbed off on me without my noticing. Don't talk about a thing until you understand its full shape. Part of it, if I'm being honest, was that some quiet corner of me wanted to hold this one thing that was only mine, at least until I knew what to do with it. I finished the attic that day, boxed the ornaments for donation, kept the glove, left my mother's dresses exactly where they were, because none of us were ready for that conversation yet either. I put the shoebox in my truck and drove home with it sitting on the passenger seat like it had weight, like it was a person riding beside me instead of a stack of paper. I drove to Hollis Creek the following weekend. The building was still there, a squat brick storefront that had clearly been a bakery at some point, judging by the faded ghost lettering still visible under a newer, badly peeling sign. It sat empty now, a for lease placard gone nearly white with sun in the front window. I parked across the street and sat there for 20 minutes before I worked up the nerve to call the leasing number. The property manager was a friendly, harried woman named Priya who explained, once I gave her my father's name, that the building had technically been owned by a trust for the last 11 years, a trust that had, until his death 3 weeks earlier, listed Walter Ferris as trustee. Who's the beneficiary? I asked. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. There was a pause on her end of the line, the particular kind of pause that happens when someone realizes they're about to say something that matters more than they expected it to when they picked up the phone. According to our records, she said slowly, the sole beneficiary is a woman named Louise Abbott. I sat in my car outside that empty bakery for a long time after we hung up, trying to work out what kind of man does that. Keeps a debt paid in silence for 4 decades. Manages a trust for 11 years without one word to the children who will eventually inherit everything else he owns. I still don't have a clean answer for that. I don't think there is one. I think my father was the kind of man who could carry an unfinished apology for 40 years the way other men carry a bad knee. Quietly, permanently, adjusting his whole gait around it without ever once mentioning the pain. But I knew one thing with total clarity, sitting in that car. Whatever this was, it wasn't mine to quietly fold into an estate and split down the middle with my sister like it was just another asset on a spreadsheet. I found Louise Abbott 3 weeks later, 81 years old, living alone in a small apartment 2 towns over, sharp as anything, with a laugh that filled up a room before you even understood the joke. When I introduced myself at her door, said my name, said Ferris, she went very still, one hand still on the doorframe. Ferris, she repeated, like she was tasting the word. I wondered if I'd ever meet one of you. She invited me in anyway. That, I think, tells you most of what you need to know about Louise Abbott, that a stranger could show up at her door carrying her decades-old grief in a shoebox, and her first instinct was still to put the kettle on. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. She told me things about my father I had never known, not just about the falling out, but about the version of him that existed before I was born. A younger man, ambitious in a way that curdled, at some point, into something closer to fear. A man who made one bad decision at 28 and then spent the rest of his life quietly, imperfectly, trying to walk it back, without ever once having the courage to simply pick up a phone and say the word sorry out loud. He never called, she said, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer. Not once in 40 years. He just paid it. Every quarter, like clockwork, through that little trust, right up until he got sick. I used to wonder if that was cowardice or the closest thing the man had to an apology. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. I've decided it doesn't much matter which. The money was real either way. The building was real. Whatever he was too proud to say, he said it in brick and mortar for 40 years instead. I told her about the shoebox. About finding it by accident, wedged behind a water heater, 3 days after we buried him. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he was going to tell someone eventually. Men like your father don't hide things forever, Daniel. They hide them until the hiding costs more than the truth would have. She reached over and patted my hand once, gently, like she was the one comforting me instead of the other way around. I suppose you're the one it finally cost. Before I left that afternoon, she told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, standing in her doorway with the porch light already on against the coming dusk. Your sister's husband came to see me once, she said. About 4 months ago. Nice enough young man. Very interested in the Hollis Creek building. Didn't mention your father was still alive at the time, which I found strange, since Walter hadn't passed yet. Asked me a great many questions about the current market value of the property. She said that last part slowly, like she was quoting it directly, because she was. I told him it wasn't any of his business. He didn't much like that answer. I stood on her porch for a long moment after she said it. Feeling the ground shift slightly under a conversation I thought I already understood the shape of. I called Renata that evening. Told her everything. The letters, the trust, Louise, the building in Hollis Creek. I expected shock. I expected, at minimum, some version of the surprise I had felt sitting on that attic floor. What I got instead was silence. The particular kind of silence that isn't confusion. It's the silence of someone recalculating. Renata, I said, did you know about this? Another pause, longer this time. Colin found some paperwork a few months before Dad passed, she said finally, carefully, each word placed like she was setting down something fragile. We weren't sure what it meant. We didn't want to upset him while he was sick. You've known for months. We didn't know for certain, Daniel. It was just some old documents. Colin went to see Louise Abbott, I said. 4 months ago. Asked her about the current market value of the building. That's not some old documents you weren't sure about. That's due diligence. The silence on her end this time had a different texture to it entirely. It's one small building, she said finally, and her voice had shifted into the tone she used for arguments she already knew, somewhere underneath, that she'd lost. It's not going to change what either of us inherits in any meaningful way. That's not the point, and you know it. Then what is the point, Daniel? I looked out my kitchen window at my father's flannel shirt, still hanging by the back door where I hadn't yet found the courage to move it. And I thought about a woman I'd met 3 weeks earlier, who had waited 40 years for an apology that finally arrived in the form of a stranger sitting at her kitchen table, holding a shoebox. The point, I said, is that Dad spent 11 years quietly trying to make something right, without telling either of us, and the second he got sick, your husband went and priced it like a listing. That's the point. She hung up. Our father's estate attorney was a careful, measured woman named Grace Okafor, who had handled Walter Ferris's affairs for close to 15 years, and, I would come to learn, knew rather more about the Hollis Creek Trust than either Renata or I did going in. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in a small conference room with a view of a parking garage and a box of tissues placed with quiet professional foresight at the center of the table. Renata arrived with Colin, both of them dressed like the meeting was a job interview. I arrived alone, carrying a manila folder with the letters, the deed, and the passbook inside it. Grace opened the meeting by explaining, plainly, that the Hollis Creek Trust was a separate legal instrument from the primary estate, that it had never been part of the house, the retirement accounts, or anything else that would be split between Renata and me. It had, in fact, been irrevocable for the past 6 years, meaning that even Walter himself, toward the end, could not have unwound it if he'd wanted to. He set it up that way on purpose, Grace said, glancing briefly at a note in her file. I remember the conversation. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, asterisk, I don't trust myself not to talk myself out of it eventually. Make it so I can't. Asterisk. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, hearing that. My father, half-formed as his apology was, had at some point made himself unable to take it back. That felt, suddenly, like the most honest thing I'd learned about him all month. Colin, for his part, spent much of the meeting with his jaw set in a particular way I'd come to recognize over 14 years of holidays. The look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want anyone else to see him doing. When Grace finished laying out the terms, he cleared his throat. I think it's worth asking, he said, in the measured tone of a man who has rehearsed sounding reasonable, whether Walter was fully of sound mind when he set up an irrevocable trust benefiting someone entirely outside the family. 6 years ago he was already, 73? These things happen more than people realize. Undue influence. Diminished capacity. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm only saying it's worth looking into. The room went quiet in a way that had teeth in it. Colin, Grace said, with the particular patience of a professional who has heard this exact sentence from a great many relatives over a great many years, I drafted that trust myself. Personally interviewed your father-in-law about his intentions on 3 separate occasions, and had him independently evaluated by a geriatric physician specifically because I anticipated a conversation exactly like this one. He was competent. He was clear. And he was, if I may say so, unusually specific about wanting it protected from exactly this kind of second-guessing. She closed her folder with a soft, definitive click. I'd advise against pursuing that line of thinking any further. Colin didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting. Renata stared at the table. I told Louise about the meeting the following week, over coffee at her kitchen table, which had become something of a habit by then. She listened to the whole thing. The attorney, the trust, Colin's undue influence comment, with the particular stillness of someone who has heard variations of this story many times over a long life, and is no longer surprised by any of them. People confuse 2 different things, she said finally, stirring her coffee slowly though she took it black. They confuse this is inconvenient for me with this must be wrong. Your sister's husband isn't asking whether your father was competent. He's asking why the money isn't his. Those are very different questions dressed up to look like the same one. I don't know how to fix this with Renata, I admitted. I don't know if there's anything left to fix. Louise considered that for a long moment, looking out her kitchen window at nothing in particular. Your father spent 40 years managing a debt he never had the courage to name out loud, she said. That's not a fixed thing, Daniel. That's a man who chose the quiet, incomplete version of doing right instead of the harder, honest version. I don't say that unkindly. I loved him once, in the complicated way you love someone who's wronged you, and then spent decades trying, badly, to make up for it. But I won't pretend the quiet version cost him nothing, either. It cost him the chance to ever actually say it to my face. It cost him 40 years of an apology sitting half-finished in a shoebox behind a water heater. She looked at me directly. Don't do the same thing with your sister. Say the whole thing, even the parts that don't feel finished yet, even if she doesn't want to hear it. I drove to Renata's house on a Sunday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks after the funeral, with no plan beyond the intention to actually say the whole thing out loud, whatever shape it ended up taking. She was on the porch when I pulled up, sitting in one of the wicker chairs she and Colin had bought the previous summer, a mug of tea going cold on the little table beside her. She watched me walk up the driveway without saying anything, which was, for Renata, its own kind of statement. I'm not here to fight, I said, sitting down in the chair across from her. That would be new, she said, but there wasn't much heat in it. We sat there for a while in the particular silence of two people who have known each other their entire lives and are trying to work out whether there's anything left worth saying. I keep thinking about the letters, I said finally. Not the ones from Louise. The ones I imagined Dad wanted to write back to her and never did. 40 years of almost apologies. I don't want that to be us, Renata. I don't want to be 79 years old someday, looking back at this, wishing I'd just said the actual thing instead of managing around it. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her cold mug slowly on the little table. I didn't know about Colin going to see her, she said finally. Not the details of it. I want you to believe that, even if you don't believe anything else I say today. Do you believe it yourself? She didn't answer that directly, which was, I think, its own kind of answer. But she did say one more thing, quietly, looking out at the street instead of at me. I think I let myself not ask the questions I should have asked, she said. About what he was doing, about why. It was easier not to know. I think that's the part one actually have to sit with. She looked at me then, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there wasn't a strategy behind her expression. Just something tired and a little bit ashamed. I'm not going to fight you on Hollis Creek, Daniel. I never really thought I could, not honestly. I think I just didn't want to be the one who had to say that out loud first. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the clean, cinematic reconciliation you'd want if this were a different kind of story. But it was more honest than any conversation we'd had in years, and I've come to believe that honest and incomplete beats smooth and false every time. If this kind of story is your thing, the quiet reveals, the family reckonings, the moments where you finally see the people around you clearly, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel more than you'd think. Drop a comment too. I read every single one, and I always want to know which part landed for you. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I get to the ending, because I think it's the piece that actually taught me something, more than the shoebox or the trust or even the meeting in Grace Okafor's office. About 3 weeks after the porch conversation with Renata, Colin called me. Not Renata, Colin, directly, which had never once happened in 14 years of marriage between him and my sister. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. I want to explain something, he said, without any greeting. About Louise Abbott. Okay. There was a long pause on his end, long enough that I could hear him breathing, deciding something. My father lost his business the same way, he said finally. Not the details, but the shape of it. A partner who quietly restructured him out of what he'd built. I was 14. I watched it take him apart for the rest of his life, piece by piece, until there wasn't much of him left to watch. Another pause. When I found those old documents in your dad's files, and I started putting together what had actually happened with Louise, I didn't go see her because I wanted to steal from anybody, Daniel. I went because for about a week I convinced myself I was protecting Renata's family the way nobody protected mine. I told myself that was noble. It wasn't. It was just old fear wearing a different coat. I didn't say anything for a moment. It was, without question, the most honest thing Colin had ever said to me. That doesn't make it right, I said finally. No, he agreed. It doesn't. I'm not calling to ask you to forgive it. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know it wasn't greed, exactly. It was something closer to fear dressed up as strategy, and I let it run for a lot longer than I should have before I noticed what it actually was. He exhaled slowly. I'm not proud of it. I wanted you to hear that from me directly, instead of guessing at it forever. I thought about my father then. About 40 years of an apology that never quite found its way into words. About a debt he was willing to pay quietly, but never willing to name out loud. I thought about how close Colin had come to doing the exact same thing, and how, unlike my father, he'd actually managed to say it before it calcified into another silent, half-finished thing sitting behind somebody's water heater for the next generation to stumble across by accident. Thank you for telling me, I said, and I meant it. It didn't fix everything between us. Colin and I are still, at best, cordially distant. Two men who share a family without ever quite becoming friends. But there's something different in the room now when we're together, some old tension that isn't there anymore. And I think that's because he did the one thing my father never managed across 4 decades. He said the true thing out loud, to the person it actually concerned, while there was still time for it to matter. The estate settled 2 months later. The Hollis Creek Trust stayed exactly as my father had structured it. Untouched, unclaimed by either of his children, fully and permanently in Louise Abbott's name, the way he'd apparently always intended once he found the nerve to set it in motion, even if he never found the nerve to say the words that should have gone with it. Colin didn't come to the final meeting. Renata came alone, which I noticed, and which I think was its own quiet message. She signed the papers without argument. Afterward, in the parking garage, she said one more thing before we went our separate ways to our separate cars. For what it's worth, she said, I think Dad would have been glad it was you who found that shoebox. Not me. A small, wry, almost smile. I would have sold the building by Friday and called it efficient. I still see Renata sometimes. Holidays, mostly, and the occasional phone call that no longer starts with real estate logistics. Something between us has gone quieter than it used to be. Not quite anger, not quite forgiveness, just a kind of honest distance that came from both of us finally saying the true thing out loud on that porch instead of managing around it the way our father managed around his own unfinished business for 40 years. I think, in its own way, that's more repair than we'd had in a long time. I don't know if it's finished. I don't think these things ever fully are. Louise and I still have coffee every few weeks. She's teaching me to play gin rummy, badly, and taking a great deal of pleasure in beating me at it. Last month she told me, apropos of nothing, that she thought my father would have liked knowing it was me who finally knocked on her door, instead of a lawyer's letter arriving in the mail after he was already gone. He'd have liked that it took a person, she said, laying down a winning hand with visible satisfaction. Not paperwork. I think about that a great deal. About the difference between paying a debt and actually facing it. My father managed the first, quietly, for 11 years, and never quite worked up the courage for the second in his entire lifetime. I like to believe that finding that shoebox, driving up to Hollis Creek, and sitting at Louise Abbott's kitchen table was the last piece of an apology my father started and couldn't finished, in the end, by his son instead, without either of us ever planning it that way. Some debts get paid in money. The real ones get paid in showing up, in person, and saying the whole thing out loud, even the parts that don't feel finished yet. My father managed the first for 40 years. I gotta be the one who finally did the second. Thanks for sticking around for this one. If you want more stories like it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.